I'm Professor Richard D. Wolff, and thank you for joining me. The headline we're examining today, something that cuts right through the usual media noise. The U.S. Appeals Court has struck down the Trump-era tariffs, and while the headlines may frame this as a simple legal dispute, I want to dig deeper. I want us to understand what this really reveals about capitalism, the state, and the illusion of free markets, because this is not just about tariffs. This is about who runs the economy, who benefits from policy, and who pays the price when things go wrong. Now, for those who may not remember, the Trump administration imposed sweeping tariffs, particularly targeting Chinese imports, under the pretext of protecting American jobs and industries. It was sold to the public as a bold move against globalization and unfair trade practices. But let's be honest, these tariffs were not about helping workers. They were about shifting the blame for declining U.S. industry away from corporate decision makers and onto foreign governments. And now, with this court decision striking down those tariffs, we're seeing something quite revealing. This ruling isn't just a rejection of a specific trade policy, it's an admission, albeit indirect, that capitalism cannot solve the problems it creates. Trump used tariffs to distract from the long-term corporate strategy of offshoring jobs for higher profits. Decades of deindustrialization weren't caused by China. They were decisions made in boardrooms by U.S. capitalists who abandoned American workers for cheaper labor abroad. That's the system. That's the logic of profit. And the courts, they're not neutral referees. They're part of the same machinery that protects capitalist interests. When tariffs disrupt global supply chains in ways the corporate class doesn't like, that's when the court steps in, not when workers lose their pensions, not when healthcare becomes unaffordable, but when profit margins are threatened. Let's not forget consumers paid those tariffs, prices rose, inflation spiked, and who suffered most? The working class again. And now the court reverses the policy, not because it hurt working people, but because it didn't align with the global capitalist order that U.S. elites helped design. This is the cycle. Capitalism creates a problem, scapegoats someone else, implements a policy that doesn't work, and then quietly reverses it when it becomes inconvenient for the ruling class. And through it all, the vast majority of people are never invited into the conversation. No vote, no voice. So the real issue isn't the legality of the tariffs. It's the structure of an economic system where power is concentrated, profits are prioritized, and democracy is pushed aside in favor of elite decision-making. If we want an economy that actually serves people, working people, not corporate boards, we need to look beyond these policy squabbles. We need a fundamentally different system, one where workers control the enterprises, where trade is democratically managed, and where the economy is organized around human need, not private greed, in a ruling that's sending ripples across political, legal, and economic circles. The U.S. Court of Appeals has struck down a central pillar of the Trump administration's trade policy, the controversial tariffs imposed on a broad range of imported goods, most notably from China. While the media headlines may reduce this to a legal technicality or partisan win, the deeper story is far more consequential and far more revealing. This ruling is not simply a matter of court procedure. It is a glimpse into the inner workings of modern capitalism, the relationship between the state and the economy, and the often overlooked interests that guide major policy decisions. The court's decision challenges the legitimacy of the legal foundation on which the Trump tariffs were based. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which allows the president to impose tariffs on the grounds of national security. Under this provision, the Trump administration levied duties on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods, claiming it was a defensive measure to protect American industry and jobs from unfair foreign competition. But was it really about national security, or was it, as many economists and legal scholars warned from the beginning, a politically motivated maneuver to mask the real crisis facing American labor and production? What the court has now exposed, intentionally or not, is the hollowness of that justification. National security was never seriously threatened by washing machines from Korea or steel from Canada. The justification, like so many others in the modern economic playbook, was largely symbolic, designed to galvanize political support and redirect public anger toward external scapegoats rather than internal systems. That this rationale has now failed in the courts should invite far more than just legal commentary. It demands an economic reckoning. But here's where it gets more interesting and troubling. The ruling comes not during the height of public debate over jobs or trade, but only after significant pressure from corporate stakeholders, importers, and multinational firms who had grown weary of the cost and complexity introduced by the tariffs. In other words, this wasn't a grassroots-driven legal victory. It wasn't workers or unions who brought this challenge forward. It was capital. It was the business class that ultimately decided these tariffs were no longer convenient, no longer profitable, no longer aligned with the smooth functioning of global supply chains. And when capital speaks in the American legal system, courts listen. This reveals a core truth about how economic policy operates in capitalist democracies. The major changes are not determined by the public interest, but by the shifting priorities of those who control investment and production. When tariffs briefly served corporate strategies by pressuring foreign rivals or encouraging domestic production, they were tolerated. But once they began to interfere with profit margins, once global suppliers and retailers raised objections, the legal machinery kicked in to reverse course. This is not how democracy is supposed to work. This is how capitalism works when dressed in the garments of law. And now, with the tariffs overturned, we're left with yet another example of how political theatrics can create the illusion of protectionism, sovereignty, and economic justice, only to collapse under the weight of corporate interests. The people were told the tariffs were for their benefit, but when the courts intervened, it was not on behalf of those people. It was on behalf of capital. The illusion shattered, not because justice prevailed, but because the profits stopped flowing. So as we dissect this ruling, let's ask the harder questions. Why was the economic power to reshape trade policy concentrated in the executive branch to begin with? Why were these sweeping tariffs imposed without democratic input or labor oversight? And why is it that only when capital suffers, legal institutions mobilize to act? This court decision is more than a footnote in a policy debate. It is a sharp reminder that in our current system, economic policy is not primarily about jobs, fairness, or national strength. It is about who controls the levers of power and who benefits when those levers are pulled. When the Trump administration introduced sweeping tariffs on imported goods, primarily targeting China, it was marketed to the American public as a bold act of economic nationalism. We were told these measures would protect American jobs, revive domestic manufacturing, and push back against decades of so-called unfair foreign trade. On the surface, this seemed like a radical departure from the free market orthodoxy that had dominated U.S. economic policy for decades. But beneath the populist language and patriotic posturing was a far more familiar reality. These tariffs, like so many policies before them, were designed not to empower workers, but to serve and protect entrenched corporate interests. The seductive promise of bringing back factory jobs, of standing up to China, and of reasserting American economic strength played well on the campaign trail. But once implemented, the tariffs functioned as little more than a smokescreen, obscuring the true causes of industrial decline and economic insecurity in the United States. And more importantly, they deflected attention away from the actual decision makers who orchestrated that decline, American corporations themselves. It wasn't China that shuttered factories in Michigan or hollowed out communities in Ohio. It was U.S.-based executives acting entirely within the logic of profit maximization who chose to offshore production, downsize workforces, and automate operations because doing so promised greater returns for shareholders. The real story of deindustrialization in America is not one of foreign aggression, but of domestic corporate strategy. And yet, when the pain of those decisions became politically unbearable, the blame was conveniently outsourced. Tariffs became a political weapon not against foreign adversaries, but against a rising tide of discontent within America itself. They offered a short-term narrative that distracted from long-term accountability. The administration knew that globalization had left millions of workers behind, and rather than confront the system that enabled it, the system that rewarded companies for abandoning their labor base, they instead turned to scapegoating. Foreign nations, especially China, were painted as villains, while the domestic architects of economic dislocation continued business as usual. Meanwhile, the corporations that had profited for decades from cheap overseas labor and global supply chains quickly adapted to the new tariff environment. Many passed the added costs on to consumers, others lobbied for exemptions. Some even reshuffled production routes to circumvent the tariffs entirely. In the end, they remained largely insulated from the pain. It was the workers, again, who bore the brunt through higher prices, fewer job opportunities, and an even more uncertain economic future. The idea that these tariffs were a populist uprising against globalization simply doesn't hold up under scrutiny. What we witnessed was not the use of state power to rebalance economic injustice, but rather a strategic performance aimed at maintaining the existing balance of power. The beneficiaries of this policy were not the blue-collar workers in whose name it was enacted, but the very corporations and political actors who have long profited from a deeply unequal system. And therein lies the real story. When public anger threatens to break the surface, when inequality grows too visible to ignore, the system doesn't reform, it redirects. It crafts new narratives, finds new scapegoats, and deploys the state to protect capital while appearing to side with labor. The tariffs, far from being a challenge to global capitalism, were just another maneuver within it, a tactical repositioning designed to manage perception rather than reality. What's more, this tactic is not unique to tariffs or trade policy. It's part of a broader playbook used repeatedly throughout history, from tax cuts wrapped in middle-class relief, rhetoric to deregulation justified by promises of innovation, the political class has become expert at framing corporate agendas in the language of public interest. The Trump tariffs fit neatly into this tradition, policy wrapped in patriotism, with profits hiding just beneath the flag. When we see trade policies dressed up as protectionism, we must ask, protection for whom? For workers or for wealth? The answer, once the rhetoric is stripped away, is rarely in doubt. Let me know if you'd like this turned into a formatted editorial or delivered as a transcript for a spoken lecture. When economic policies like tariffs are introduced, public attention often focuses on their political symbolism or their diplomatic impact, but buried beneath the headlines and campaign slogans lies a far more intimate reality, one that plays out not in global trade charts, but in grocery stores, hardware aisles, and family budgets. As with the Trump-era tariffs, the consequences didn't primarily fall on the foreign nations they targeted or the multinational corporations that lobbied around them. They landed squarely on the shoulders of American consumers, especially the working class, who bore the hidden costs through rising prices on everyday goods. It is one of the enduring contradictions of capitalist policymaking. Measures enacted under the banner of protecting the American worker routinely end up harming that very group. The tariffs were no exception. Imported goods, from electronics and appliances to raw materials like steel and aluminum, became more expensive virtually overnight. And in a consumer-driven economy like the United States, where most working-class households already live paycheck to paycheck, even modest increases in costs can create significant pressure. But these were not modest increases. These were systemic cost inflations that touched nearly every facet of household spending. The political justification for the tariffs emphasized national self-reliance and economic sovereignty. But the economic reality was that many of the products subject to tariffs had no affordable domestic alternatives. The global supply chain, carefully constructed by decades of corporate outsourcing and just-in-time logistics, was not designed to serve national interest. It was designed to serve profit. And so when tariffs disrupted those chains, companies simply did what they always do in such situations. They passed the added costs on to consumers. In other words, the punishment intended for foreign exporters was diverted, rerouted, and delivered to American households at the cash register. And yet the burden wasn't shared equally. Higher income individuals and large firms absorbed the price increases with relative ease, often by adjusting their purchasing patterns, leveraging tax advantages, or shifting supply relationships. But for working people who already spend a disproportionate share of their income on goods and services, there was no such flexibility. Their choices were limited. Their margins were thin. The inflationary ripple effects triggered by the tariffs, whether on groceries, electronics, cars, or construction materials, were deeply felt at the bottom of the income distribution, while the top adjusted, insulated, and protected. This quiet transfer of cost is rarely discussed in policy debates. It's not as headline-grabbing as trade wars or diplomatic standoffs, but it is precisely where the real story lies, because once again we see a pattern repeated. Economic policy is shaped by political narratives that promise protection, but when the dust settles, it is the working class who ends up footing the bill. There's an even deeper issue here, one that rarely surfaces in mainstream coverage. When workers suffer under the weight of these indirect costs, higher consumer prices, reduced purchasing power, and greater financial precarity. The blame is never clearly assigned. Tariffs become an abstract talking point, not a lived economic reality. The average consumer may notice that goods cost more, but they're rarely told why. The structural connection between international trade policy and their rising grocery bill is obscured by a media and political class that prefers simplified storylines over systemic analysis. And yet, if we look closely, the pattern becomes undeniable, whether through austerity, tax reform, deregulation, or tariffs. The outcome is strikingly consistent. Economic policy decisions made at the top are absorbed at the bottom. Costs are socialized downward, benefits are privatized upward. The Trump tariffs may have been marketed as a hardline stance against globalization, but they were, in effect, another expression of it. They exposed the fragility of a system built on global dependence while deepening the burdens on those least able to carry them. Behind the flag waving and the slogans, behind the promises of economic revival, lay an all too familiar reality: profits protected, workers sacrificed, and consumers paying the price, quietly, invisibly, and without recourse. Let me know if you'd like this tailored further for delivery in a speech, video, or print column. For decades, Americans have been told a story that the loss of good, paying manufacturing jobs, the decline of industrial regions, and the shuttering of factories across the nation were all unfortunate side effects of an increasingly competitive global economy. Foreign nations, especially China, were painted as aggressive market players responsible for America's economic dislocation. But when we dig deeper and examine who actually made the decisions that led to this collapse, the story begins to look very different. The truth is that the primary architects of American industrial decline were not foreign governments, but American corporations themselves. It wasn't Chinese officials who decided to close textile mills in the Carolinas or relocate steel production from Pennsylvania to Southeast Asia. It was U.S. corporate executives who, when faced with the opportunity to drastically cut labor costs and boost profit margins, chose to outsource production. These were not acts of coercion. They were strategic business decisions made in full accordance with the rules and incentives of a capitalist system that rewards the pursuit of maximum returns over national loyalty, community stability, or long-term employment. The invisible hand of the market, we're told, works for everyone, but it has always had a far heavier grip on workers than on capital. What the Trump-era tariffs attempted to do was rewrite that narrative by placing the blame for domestic economic pain onto external enemies. The policy claimed to defend the American worker from unfair foreign competition, especially from Chinese state-backed industries. But this conveniently ignored the fact that it was U.S. firms that moved their operations overseas in the first place. Not under duress, but by design. They embraced globalization not as a threat, but as an opportunity, a way to sever their reliance on well-paid American labor and replace it with cheaper, more vulnerable workforces abroad. This is why the rhetoric of protectionism rings so hollow, because the damage had already been done long before the tariffs were imposed. The industrial base wasn't destroyed by imported goods. It was dismantled by domestic corporate decisions driven by shareholder pressure, executive bonuses, and short-term gains. Tariffs then became a kind of economic theater, a performance to suggest that the government was finally fighting back, when in reality it was papering over decades of complicit policymaking and corporate betrayal. But here's the hook. While the public was told that tariffs were a blow against globalism, the corporations that had globalized their operations were rarely, if ever, forced to bring those jobs back. There was no policy requiring companies to reinvest in American industry, no demand that they restore wages or rebuild communities hollowed out by years of divestment. The tariffs may have penalized imports, but they did nothing to reverse the deeper trend of capital flight. The system that incentivized outsourcing remained fully intact. Moreover, the public debate rarely centered on the actual reasons corporations left in the first place. There was no widespread discussion of the role of suppressed wages, the decline of unions, or the offloading of public investment into infrastructure and education, all factors that made U.S. labor increasingly uncompetitive by design. Instead, a simpler narrative prevailed: blame China, impose tariffs, and call it a policy win. This misdirection is not accidental. It is a core feature of how capitalist economies manage dissent. When crises emerge, whether unemployment, inequality, or industrial collapse, the system offers convenient scapegoats rather than confront its own internal contradictions. Foreign nations are easier to blame than domestic boardrooms. The result is a cycle of economic misdiagnosis where symptoms are treated while the disease goes unchecked. The central irony is painful. The very corporations that lobbied for free trade agreements, that championed deregulation and labor suppression, were shielded from accountability while the public was told to fear external threats. Tariffs didn't fix the problem, they obscured its origins. And in doing so, they allowed the same economic class that offshored America's industrial future to escape scrutiny yet again.